Hello, everyone, and welcome to this fantastic roundtable discussion with the creators of this new opera, The Priestess of Morphine, a forensic study of Marie-Madeleine in the time of the Nazis. And in particular, the celebration of the release on March 12th. And we're here with the opera composer, librettist, the performers that you will get to hear on this fantastic release. So welcome everyone. And I'd love if we can go around and have people introduce yourself and tell us what you do in this production. Let's start with composer Rosśa Crean.
Okay, yeah, I'm Rosśa Crean, and I am the composer of this piece, of this lovely, lovely piece.
Awesome. And how about librettist Aiden Feltkamp?
Yeah, Aiden Feldkamp. I wrote the words and did the translations.
Awesome. How about Jessie?
Hi, I'm Jessie. I played Gertrude Gunter, and that's sort of the outward-facing, proprietous, acceptable version of this character.
Wonderful. And how about Katherine?
Hi, I'm Katherine, and I play Marie-Madeleine, who it's her pen name, her nom de guerre, and also representing the less constrained side and sort of opposition to Jessie's more socially acceptable version of this person. So yay, exploring dualities.
Yeah, that's so exciting. I can't wait to get into all of that. Wonderful. How about Ben?
Hi, yeah, my name is Ben Zucker, and I played vibraphone on the recording as well as at the premiere at the International Museum of Surgical Science.
Fantastic. And last but not least, Stephen.
Stephen Hudson. I played cello.
Fantastic. So wonderful to have all of you. I'm Lisa Neher, mezzo soprano and composer, and I get to just facilitate this discussion between all these wonderful co-creators of this piece. I'd love for us to start off by sharing how this piece came to be. Maybe Rosśa, you can start us off, and Aiden, and then please, everyone, feel free to chip in with how you came to be part of this awesome project.
Sure, I will try to make this as short as possible. Long story short, about, 2 years ago, my father had passed away, and I had to deal with cleaning out his house and his whole estate by myself. And at that time, Aiden and I had already written The Times of Nightfall, which had just premiered before that. And I was trying to find other like queer icons that we could bring more attention to that weren't extremely known. And I remember cleaning out my father's house, and he had hoarded so many books, and like there were 8 days in a row. I remember taking them to half price books to sell them off because there were just so many. And I remember like on day 4 or 5, I'd gone in, the people there had already known my name by then because they knew why I kept bringing books in. And I just remember being exhausted, wanting to just, just life was just not great at that point. And I remember bringing the books in and going and just like going to the back of the shop and like finding a chair and sitting there and just going like, and just feeling the exhaustion and just thinking like how long is this gonna last? And I immediately was like hunched over in the chair, and I looked up, and then I saw this book sitting right there called Priestess of Morphine, a forensic study of Marie-Madeleine. And Aiden can maybe correct me if I was wrong on that title, but it's close. And I remember just reading the back, and all of a sudden it was like I saw like the words lesbian, morphine, Nazis, and I was like, and I feel like it was my father's way of saying, I'm really sorry, here's to make up for this. And so it was like in like the economy book section, and so like I bought it for like $5 and went through it. And I remember like contacting Aiden and going, I really think you need to read this book. I think this is something that we need to work on. And hand it to Aiden for that from
Uh,
there.
yeah, this book is like 100% up my alley because first of all, it's queer history, which I love studying it. I love learning new things about it that I just didn't know. And Marie-Madeleine is part of that. I did not know who she was or her work before this. And also, I love, love, love German poetry. It's something that it's really kind of the reason that beside opera, it's the reason that I've really kept up with my German and really improved my German. It's because I love reading German poetry. And German poetry from this time period specifically is super interesting to me. So to have all these like intersecting interests in one book and in one kind of story was just like perfect. So 100%, I just like read straight through it, was super excited by it, and was like, yeah, we need to do this. And the interesting thing to me was the more I looked into it, the less I found because almost no one in English speaking countries had looked into her work, had looked into her history. Most of it was still in German. And this one book was kind of like the only English translated of English translations of her work, but also English translated like history and study of her life. So super, super great find and was very excited to jump in.
That's so fantastic. And I know that there are wonderful performers. I want to hear how they got a part of this project as well. But before we get there, I wonder, can you both talk about how you decided to sort of form? I mean, this book has a lot of information in it. So how did you decide what kinds of themes you were going to pick out of her life and also her writings? How is the form of this going to take place? And maybe that meant that you were already picking out performers, or maybe not. I don't know how that process goes for you in this case, but.
For me, I had no expectations of how the libretto was going to go because I loved the idea. I remember communicating to Aiden that like I really loved that there was this forensic approach to her work and what and how, but also like the signs of the times of what was going on back then to really give a clear idea of the environment that was going on around her at the time and how that was able to then influence so much of her work. I feel like there was such a lyricism even in the English translated portions of her poetry that I was like, this is, I think it's something that's a rarity. It was very, it was very close to what I would say would be like Rilke in poetry. And so there was a metaphysical, otherworldly kind of like presence, I think, to the things that she wrote. So, yeah.
Yeah, it definitely reminds me of Rilke a lot. The metaphysical side of it and the like spirituality, but also kind of like the intense amount of symbolism and how like everything means something else. And then the kind of openness of some of her verse, not all of it, but some of it. But what I was really excited about as I was reading about her life was kind of two things. One, that she saw the rise of the Nazis and did something specific about it, that she put together all her poetry that she knew the Nazis would hate and like re-released it in these like bright red covers to be like, I imagine like a bullfighter, like, you know, releasing the red flag of like, you know, come and get me. And I loved that. But then also this duality of she didn't have much autonomy because she was a woman, because she had to hide the fact that she was queer. She had to hide the fact that she was Jewish. And her family, her immediate family, were Nazi supporters, were part of the Nazi party. So like she was hiding in so many ways. And the only way she could really come through in any meaningful and true way was through her writing. And so I kind of wanted to bring all of those aspects together. And then the added autonomy of how she started on morphine and how that addiction happened and how it was out of her control, but then became such a huge part of her life. So kind of working with all these themes and building something around that. But like Roscia said, that like the forensic part of the book, I wanted to bring that back and be kind of like scientific and a study. And so I was like, how can we kind of merge all of these ideas together and use her words and translate her words but also bring it up to speed to make it relevant to now. Because it didn't even need to try to be relevant. It is and was extremely relevant to now. So we didn't really have to do much there.
Yeah, and
Absolutely.
I love the way that like we had a few versions of what we were trying to like. We had to try to figure out how it was going to work. And I remember reading that final version and being like, this is so perfect. Number one, because a monodrama is usually one person, and now we can use two people. and also like the idea that it's almost like song cycle style, where we have these movements, but we let each character almost, well, each of the two characters kind of switch off their realities with a little bit of sometimes inserting the other character in for like a couple measures and then they're out the door again. It was being able to kind of do that. So when people are like, well, what exactly would you call this? I say, well, it's a monodrama for two people in song cycle style. And I'm like, that's all I can explain it as. So
I think
but
that's so awesome.
yeah, but then once we had that finished, I 100% knew I had to have Katherine, I had to have Jessie, because I work with them both quite a bit. I know their voices like the back of my hand. I know what their strengths are. I know what their challenges are. And I know exactly how they're going to convey the music that I write for them. And knowing that I can write for them certain nuances that might not be a bit like possible for every soprano to do, not necessarily. I knew I can put some of those in because they're both dynamic singers and they're very good interpreters. And I think it was something that was just a no-brainer. And I'm sure there's times where Katherine wanted to choke me for giving her high passages, but she just does them so flawlessly that I couldn't help it. And then I knew I wanted to do, because when Aiden and I wrote Times of Nightfall, I had written it for vibraphone, cello, violin, and piano. And nope, that's not true. It was vibraphone, cello, piano. And it shows you this was not that long ago, and I'm still forgetting. But I knew I wanted that similar combination again, because the vibraphone can do so many sounds, and honestly, a piano just isn't always the most available instrument, and also the most easily to prepare. So I knew I wanted the piano out, and I wanted to bring a violin in so I can start working with the dynamic of those three instruments. I think we do it really well. I knew I wanted to have, so Ben and Stephen had both played in a couple excerpts of the Times of Nightfall at Northwestern, and so I knew that I loved their playing on those pieces, and I knew they understood the tones and the kind of environments they like to create. So I was like, immediately like, hey, are you interested in doing this? Because I really want you guys first. So yeah, and then we went from there.
That's so awesome. And I'd love, why don't we start with Ben? I'd love for you to tell us about what it was like to get involved in the project, and what was your process like preparing for the premiere and also the recording?
Sure. Yeah, so it's true. That was I was pulling up, trying to figure out like how exactly this all started. And it's true. Still, 2018, like spring 2018, when me and Stephen played the excerpts from Times or Nightfall for a colleague's voice recital. And yeah, the fact that I think that Rosśa, that you were there as to guide everything, so closely and lovingly in person, I mean that sets up like in a very like a strong relationship and a very good impression of it. Is like, yes, this is like someone that is good to know and be around, and I'm glad that the opportunity to work with you came again. In all the kinds of ways that this project proceeded to take shape. I'm not normally a new music percussionist. My day job is, I guess, as a composer and improvising vibraphonist, but you know, this is such an important become a way to explore like all of the sounds that you've talked about. And I remember talking about this with Stephen, that one of the things is that we like so much about this music is that sort of no instrument, of course, is sort of like relegated to being entirely just background or something that is simply carries something else along. Everything has sort of like an intensely involved quality at all times that creates something actively interesting to play and hear at all times. So I mean, also then, you know, it's like pressure's on, sort of preparing a part, you know, a part like that. This is all very, it's intimate and exposed in terms of how the lines are constructed. I, you know, can't speak for everybody, but it seems that way. So yeah, it involved, you know, it involved a lot of practice, a lot of working it out together. And yeah, doing it together was almost certainly one of the most important parts of this, both in sort of like in the rehearsal process leading up to the performances, getting accustomed to the premiere space itself, you know, doing it again for the recording session, and also again for a storefront theater production that happened, you know, right before that whole thing happened.
Oh, I already totally forgot about that.
Oh no, Rhino Fest was, seconding Ben. Every single time we were in a different space, it was okay because, you know, the first performance was in the round, so we had audience on all sides, and it was in a very live space, like everything echoed, and then being all marble and just statues, and you'd sing into a corner and it wasn't really a corner. And then Rhino Fest was this very kind of absorptive black box space with, I think, a brick wall and then also like a wood wall. So even singing to the two different walls was very different. And orchestra was behind us versus, it was just a very different experience. So yeah, definitely adjusting to everything on the fly was a very interesting experience.
That's crazy. I'd love to hear too from Stephen, you know, your thoughts on sort of getting involved in the project and how do you view this music from the cello position, you know, and what you're bringing to this musical drama and the textures and all of that?
Yeah, well, I think Roscia already mentioned that I first got acquainted with his work in this place where we were performing excerpts of a different piece on somebody's vocal recital. And I remember being like, I mean, as a cello player at Northwestern, I got to play all kinds of different things. And I just remember being floored by his, or their music particularly, because it was just so resonant. And there were these like just beautiful cello lines that made me feel like I was playing my best cello playing. And that's really like what drew me to this project and what, you know, I mean, what draws me to music in the first place, right? I mean, that's the whole reason I play cello, is to try to make beautiful sound. And so I felt like this piece just gave me so many opportunities to do that. And then of course, you know, that like everyone is saying about this this venue where we did the premiere. I mean, for one thing, it was such a unique location. I think I was playing under. I think for the performances, I sat underneath a statue of Röntgen, the guy who one of the scientists who discovered radiation sickness or something. And it was you know, I've never played a gig in a cooler location than that. But also just the sound of the space was just so unique. And that was both a challenge and just like I don't know, really a gift to us as musicians to kind of like experience the sound of a place like that. So
that's so fantastic. Jessie and Katherine, I wonder, can you talk about, you know, you both are playing in this opera different ways of looking at the same person, you know? I mean, the monodrama for two singers, as Roscia was saying. So what was that like to prepare the character and your facets of the character in this piece?
Intimate. And I mean, honestly, that's the overall feeling that I had. In order for us to pull this off, both dramatically and musically, we had to just be together, practice together, be really, with each other. And then also there was the fact that with these sort of rotating spaces, I've said this before and I'll say it again, but the space itself is a third character in that you have to interact with it differently. And especially in the museum where the sound rang for so long, it was almost like you had to change your approach to the singing to accommodate for that. It was like someone else singing in the background, just your own voice reflected back to you. And that was especially interesting, I think, in the a cappella movement, which I love how much people seem to respond to that. That was really gratifying because that was very difficult for Katherine and myself to learn. Yeah, that's my thought there.
Yeah, and jumping off of that, Jessie and I would meet before every single, like anytime we had Harvest Song, which is that a cappella movement, we were staging it, we were rehearsing it, we were running the show, we were doing anything. We met like 15 to 20 minutes ahead of time. We would be the first ones in the space and just run it and make sure we had the staging, see where we were kind of at that day, which was really great. It's honestly, that was the hardest part of the entire show. Roscia has sort of mentioned that they wrote Marie-Madeleine to be a very difficult part, and some of it is difficult. Like you have this very heightened poetic language on top of this very rangy part, and that poses its own difficulties for clarity, and especially in this very echoey space and making sure that we take time. But the fifth movement was just the hardest thing to sync, and when it was locked, and then the movement just flew. But going back to what has been mentioned about how each part is its own, it functions as its own voice and its own characterization. There are choices that I made because Ben made a certain choice, or because Stephen made a certain choice on something, and I'm like, oh, that's the tone we're setting. That's it. I love it. Okay, here we go. Because there's a whole section where Ben has this really huge solo bit, and there were so many beautiful choices and sounds that were made, and I was like, yeah, I don't really need to, like, I need to do stuff, but what this is that's her inner monologue. I don't need to show that in my body as much as I would if this were silence, because Ben's filling in all that commentary for me. And it's things like that where it's just such an interplay. And especially with the way the seating was at the museum, which was the big echoey marble space, was the vibraphone was on one side of the space and the cello and violin were on the other side of the space. And so, and Jessie and I were sort of caught in the middle in a way. And so we had these opposing voices literally melding together and coming in, and we could play in the space based on where the commentary was coming from, which was super fun. Presenting its own challenges. And but I think Marie sings like a dream. Other sopranos may disagree with me when they look at the score and think I'm nuts, but I think it sings like a dream, and Jessie sounds like a dream with Gertrude. And oh my gosh, there were the duet sections with Jessie are just, especially in quarantine where I haven't really we haven't performed live with anybody in a year. And Jessie and I were kind of going back and forth, like, what would we give to sing this live again, just to like sing and make loud noises at each other and feel those vibrations of another person. It's this high we haven't been able to chase in a while. But yeah, it was just a really interesting experience, sort of curated by the spaces that we were in unintentionally, of what choices are we making? How has this grown as our time with the piece has increased? And also what changes do we need to make with the space? And also for our audience, like Rhino Fest was like at a really, if I remember correctly, it was a very like slightly late time of night. So the type of audience we were getting, it was like an 8:30 or a 9 o'clock show or something. So we're getting like essentially folks who go to indie opera festivals, which is a very different audience than, because we premiered during Pride. And so a bunch of my friends who came straight from the Pride Parade. And, you know, so everyone's decked out in Pride gear. And it was just like hella queer. And then we're going to Rhino Fest, which is a very different space, a very different vibe. And what choices do we make differently? It was very fun to explore. But yeah, it's spanned the gamut. And that's, you know, you just fall in love with this piece a little bit differently every time, I think.
I do want to hop, sorry, if I could, I do want to hop in on something that Katherine said as well, that the scale of this piece, in that it is intimate, it is small, it, you know, it is something that can be put in a small space, physically, a small space. I think one of the things that I enjoy about that is the feedback from the people who are watching you, because they don't realize until they're in it that when you are next to an opera singer and you are next to this you know, instrumental ensemble, you feel it in your body. You feel their voices and what they are doing. And I think that's a sensory experience people don't expect and really respond to. And, you know, I just think that's something you don't get in grand opera, at the Lyric, at the Met, all that stuff. That's really worth the investment.
I love that.
One of the things I was most excited about when I got asked to do this production is I had seen Jessie and Katherine both sing in, I think it was Turn of the Screw by Chicago Fringe Opera. That was the first time I'd seen either of you sing. And I think, that was such a cool experience. I had never had this experience before of like being right next to an opera singer performing. And I think maybe as singers, you get to experience that all the time. But, you know, for me as somebody in the audience, that was just so cool. And then so to have, I think that's like really, I think a critical part of this piece. And so if you're listening to this recording on CD, you might, you know, turn it up to 11 and see if you can really like try to capture some of that intensity of that, because it's small. You're right, it's small and it's intimate, but it's also like so huge because of the huge emotions involved.
Yeah, I think a big goal I had as a synesthete was creating the colors that I really wanted to have emotionally put out there. And I think people originally, like even some of the couple reviews we've had so far mentioned like the smaller ensemble, but then they're kind of unexpectedly hear the sound that comes from that kind of ensemble. And especially at the Surgical Museum when we premiered it, yeah, like it was so live. And I remember telling Katherine and Jessie during rehearsals, especially when we first started approaching Harvest Song, going like, I guarantee this is going to be the piece this is the pivotal part of this entire thing, and you are going to sing and be able to hear a pin drop when you're not singing. I guarantee it. And that has for surely been the case, because as someone who grew up singing chansons in bars and pubs as a little kid, as I would be like the only singer, and then here is this little child coming in, and you have all these grown men playing their instruments, and all of a sudden, like out of nowhere, unexpectedly, I would just sing by myself, and the entire pub would just shut up and listen, because they're so used to hearing the cacophony after a while that all of a sudden it's like, oh, what's going on now? And it was the same thing with this. We have all these different textures, but there's a lot of tension within that throughout in order to like portray the characters correctly. And I knew the moment the Harvest Song would start, everyone would just be glued. And it was just an amazing thing the very first night we did it, to just stand at the podium and just like no conducting, didn't have to conduct them, nothing. And looking around at the people who were there to see this, and eyes were glued. And anytime they moved, every eye followed them. And it was that way all the way until the next movement when the instruments came back in. And like it's a sticking to your seat kind of movement, and they just do an amazing job of it.
I love that. And I'm curious, when you're talking about like this is a texture choice and a voicestration / orchestration choice, quote unquote, like are those decisions that you're making while the libretto is being developed, or do you sort of get do you work where the libretto is kind of been baked, and then you're getting your inspiration and making those choices afterwards? Like, what is the process between you and Aiden with that?
I never have an idea of what the structure will be overall until I get the finalized libretto. Um, Aiden also gets very clear ideas of what they want to write, like once they've done their research, and so I know that what I get from them is going to be a clarity in itself, even though if it's not the finalized version. So that helps immediately when I get a first edit, and I can kind of see where it's laying. But I generally have an idea, a mental to-do list in my mind as far as what kind of passages I want for each instrument, and then those combinations when it comes to different parts of that quote unquote story. We're very nonlinear, but about knowing in the direction of telling it from beginning to end what I want to do. But I always have to remind myself too that I might end up modifying a lot and changing a lot of things because the libretto's not done yet, and there's things I need to follow as a respect to the libretto. So there's I definitely have ideas what I want to happen, but then it just matters whether it's still adaptable into the final product of the libretto.
Yeah, that's really interesting because it's definitely my process to people binge watch shows. I'll binge research a topic, just read so much stuff and in a very short amount of time, and kind of try to get into the brain space for the project. And then I start to write from that place. And when it comes to other types of writing, I don't really do this, but when it comes to libretti, I'll write so much more than ever is actually put in, because I think I cut 7/8 of what I write, and then that 1/8 will go into the libretto draft, and we'll go to Rosśa, and then I'll get their input, and then I'll come back. And I do really like the collaboration during, but then even afterwards, I'll hear something and they'll just set it in a way that I never ever would have thought of, and then it makes me think about the scene or the character or the line so much differently, and it just adds layers. And that's what I love about collaboration. It's that you can bring so much to a project, but then so does your collaborator, and then you end up with something so much more complex and so much more interesting than you would have made on your own. But yeah, I think that I try to have a pretty good draft go at all times. No one really gets my super rough stuff, because I am just no one wants to see that. It's just so rambly and insane. But the fun part about this project was doing the translations, because there were times where I'll be hey, there's 2 ways to do this. Which one do you feel stronger about? And then we would kind of decide, even on the translation, the source material being the same, there's a few different ways to translate it. And so that was fun too, to collaborate on the translation in that way.
I love that.
Yeah, because when you're translating, you usually doing it by yourself. You're not usually having input. I mean, maybe if you bring in an expert in that specific dialect or whatever, and they'll kind of have comments, but they're usually more technical, where this was kind of an artistic choice, deciding which way we wanted to go with a certain line or a certain word.
And you decided to translate, what led that versus breaking into German, because there's a lot of, non-English language opera and art song that happens. What was the inspiration for that?
Roscia, remind me if we even talked about that. I kind of just automatically started translating.
I think we both just assumed.
That's great too. I mean,
mainly just because we have a heavy English audience, and doing something that would have been the original German, I think is none of us being non-native German speakers, that there would have been a loss in translation of performance had we have done that. And so I mean, we could have easily gone through the German, and because I speak German. I believe Katherine does as well. And like, so I mean, we have the ability to go through it and understand it, but I think there's still colloquialisms that are missing when you do it in a different tongue than what you're used to doing and writing in. So I think just considering that the museum was the one who commissioned us, we knew we were not going to be doing it for a German speaking audience. And so I think it was just kind of a, yeah, I don't even think we thought.
No, I mean, that's a great reason, you know,
Yeah.
I mean, for sure. Yeah, I want to speak the language of my audience.
Yeah,
Sounds
accessibility. Yeah.
Yeah.
Accessibility is really important, especially in this. I think this specific story is so relatable and so like emotional that I really want the audience to engage as much as possible. And I think every librettist does, but I felt especially strong about this piece that like having an emotional response from the audience was very important to me. And I think that, you know, here in America, most of us speak English as a native language. And even if we don't, it's like we've learned it as a new language. And it's just that accessibility and that immediacy is something that I really thought was important for this piece.
Yeah.
Yeah, and like performing it and learning it, there are certain lines that are so visceral in the translated English that it doesn't matter when this was written. It's just a gut punch. Like she kind of has her, I always thought of them as mad scenes, but I'm not sure. There are whole dissertations about the definition of madness in classical art form, but they're her inner explorations. And she had, there's a line in there where it's, I can't live in these streets. I can't find a living body. They've all forgotten. And yeah, you can read that on a page, but to hear it sung at you, what Jessie was saying with the vibration and just these very sweet string lines under it as she's singing about this despair that we've all felt, especially now taking on a new tone with the pandemic. But there's something visceral about that yes, we are trained opera singers and we want to, we are trained to communicate in languages that are not our native ones, but there's something about the English that I was very excited to receive the score and be like, oh yes, good, it's all in English. Wonderful. Like this will add a really refreshing dynamic to this. So, and also it was a lot of friends who came to see it. It was their first opera. So it was really nice to be able to say like, hey guys, come see this really queer opera on Pride weekend in this really cool room. And it's all in English. Like, don't worry about not knowing what it is. Like, you'll get it. And it was a really nice way to both market it to people who had never been, and also for myself, my own internalization of it.
Totally.
And if I can hop off of that, so when it comes to this kind of opera, I don't think we're necessarily reaching out to the traditional opera goer. And so that level of accessibility is helpful in bringing those people in and exposing them to something that they ultimately like, but would not necessarily have felt comfortable trying if they were just like, I don't know what I'm doing here. I don't understand this. But another thing that that just occurred to me was in Harvest Song, the a cappella piece, the a cappella duet, there's a line that I feel like the buffer of translation would have lessened the impact. And it's a moment where it's like, to me, it felt like sort of a fourth wall break of Nazis are real and they are here. So I think just allowing that to be said was a gut punch, and one that was important to feel.
I love that. And both you and Katherine, well, everyone really, but just now your latest things you've shared kind of leads into the next question is for all of you, what about this work was really important to you to make right now? And there's a million things I can think of, but I want to hear what you all have to say about that.
I'm gonna let someone else talk first about this.
So for me, if it's okay that I start, I have sort of always enjoyed stories about people who don't necessarily feel like they fit in. Just because I feel like those are the people who know best who they are because they have to figure it out. They have to question it. They have to push back against these norms that don't fit them. And I think everybody has some degree of that that's real in themselves, but there are whole swaths of people who can just sort of coast without ever having that discussion with themselves. And I just think people who have had to have those thought processes are more interesting. And like, not just to observe, but to apply to yourself and think, how do I relate to this? So I think that regardless of the time is just more interesting. But now, obviously, I mean, everybody says never forget about all of these, historical horrible events, but we do over and over. So, I mean, I think it's important to be acquainted with the recurring themes in the rise of fascism. I think it's important to recognize that just because it happened once and we said, oh, that was bad, that recognition doesn't mean it won't happen again. It doesn't mean we'll find a way to let it happen, like that we won't find a way to let it happen. We have to be aware of and sort of girded against these things, or they will happen again. Especially when you're being told, oh, if you say that, you're being reactionary or, being emotional, things like that, which I'm sure plenty of us have heard. But I just think it's important to have that reminder cast in sort of a dramatic example so people feel it. And it's not just, Times New Roman on a page, because we all learned about it in school. We all, read the words, but to feel it happening, to see it happen. I mean, I was just listening to a podcast about Goebbels as, just a way to inform my ongoing education on historical events of the rise of fascism. And I'm still finding things out I didn't know, because when I learned about it, no one would have told me any of that. So I think there's a far more comprehensive education to be had on very important subjects like this. I think art plays a huge role in that.
If I may, on the role of that art, because I'm thinking about maybe on similar lines that, over the past few years, we are seeing like a real just sort of like, I don't know, exhumation of all kinds of the stories that would have otherwise been marginal, not seen as not fitting in with the sort of like, with some sort of dominant narrative. So I'm finding like those interesting people who are more interesting because they had to negotiate those, as Jessie said. And one of the things is, as I sort of like have read this research, done some of my own, and for various bits of work, is that so often we come to that sort of attitude as one of us is just sort of, there's a real sort of like pessimism in a lot of like in going through this history of in the sense that sort of like we are in a state of mourning because these were not heard in their own time and they are now lost and we will never know them. And coming at from the lens of that loss is obviously important to point out the ways in which that erasure did happen, but also then to remember to celebrate the stories and like inhabit them, I feel like on their own terms. And I think to go back to the thing about translation, that this is partially why the use of English here in the translations is so important, because it's important for us to understand it by being able to sort of like fully experience it and feel and inhabit it. Even though that this may be forensic, we are only getting sort of the traces. We may never, not exactly know how Marie-Madeleine was thinking, feeling, or functioning, but this sort of felt forensic exploration is so necessary to give that vital dimension to the otherwise, as I said, like very like pessimistic sort of work that are so much of our historicizing is taking on. Pat.
Yeah, if I could jump in. So Holocaust remembrance art is super important to me. It's something I did before this project and I've done since, and it's really interesting, like thread through some of my work. But what stands out to me about this project and something that I really wanted to get across is kind of what Ben brought up, that like it's not a pessimistic look on what we've lost. Like I really want it to feel triumphant and like hopeful. And I think that's why I wanted to start with kind of like this resurrection of her body and herself at the beginning of the piece. And I mean, we've come a long way from when I started writing this to now. And we've also kind of been in the same sort of place of like seeing these Nazi sympathizers rise up. And, you know, I mean, we right up into the insurrection. And since then, like, it's just gotten more and more intense. And I remember when I started this project, just feeling really down about, you know, where our country was going and who was in power and where that power was leading. And this project was kind of like right there in the middle of it. And as I was doing research, I was getting my hands on, you know, source material and things like that. And I actually was able to get one of the books that she had like released as like, this is, you know, the Nazis come and try to like take this away. And I remember thinking like, this physical book survived the Nazis and like is in my hand right now. Like we can fight and survive, you know? And like that just like, I don't know, something like physical from that time, like being at, like it came to my house from Germany and I just remember opening it and like being in tears because I was like, this physical thing, like this like act of queerness like survived everyone that tried to destroy it. And they did destroy a lot of her work and they destroyed a lot, especially trans history. They just destroyed so much of the research that was done at that time and the people that knew things. And so it was just so like, it was a moment of triumph to like be like, oh, I have this physical piece of history that survived and that like we too can survive. So I mean, that's what I try to get through in this piece. And I think, you know, that is a really important message that like, yeah, you face it and it's happening, but it's like, if you fight, you know, some of us and some of what we do will survive no matter what.
Yeah,
I love that.
And jumping off of that was sort of the queerness aspect of it. Like, again, we were prepping this piece and performing this piece in the middle of the Trump presidency. And like, I am queer, a significant number of us are queer, and creating this piece of unabashedly queer art. Like, there is no doubting that this is just like very gay. When I was talking about this, I would like, this is the very gay opera, and the V and the G were capitalized with a little TM emoji, right? Like, like that was how I talked about this, because, you know, they're like, morphine, which one's that? I'm like, this is the very gay TM opera, right? And so having this unabashed queerness, and she wasn't apologizing for her queerness at any point. She's I don't want to say the word quote code switching because I'm not sure if the connotation applies here or not, but she is putting on the correct mask to make it. And she had a certain amount of privilege for that. She was a woman married to a man who was high ranking and all of these things. But this piece is about her survival and some parts of her thriving even amongst this, and some parts of her not thriving because she is a very human character in this show. Like that humanity also really shines through. And so making this very queer art and having a very, you know, Roscia was incredibly supportive of all of the, like, I was like, are we allowed to make this like queer undertones? And they were like, why are we making it undertones? Just be more, okay? We can be more with this. And then, you know, like Jessie and I, of course, would have the, okay, so like the consent talk of, can I touch you? How do we feel about this? You know, is this better? How do we stagecraft this? You know, intimacy staging is very not sexy. It's very clinical. It's one of the more clinical things you do because it's so choreographed, and then how you do it is sexy. But, you know, you're sweaty, you're tired, you're singing really loud at each other. There's really not a lot that's sexy about intimacy choreography, but because the audience was right there, we really had to make it very intimate and sensual, even if it wasn't overtly sexy a lot of the time. We had to make it very sensual and very real. And so that queerness just got to shine through, and that just felt like, you know, my tiny little corner of rebellion was like, we're all terrified we're gonna like lose our rights and our personhood, but hey, we're gonna make this very affirming queer art in the face of fascism. Weird relevance, who knew? But yeah, so that was kind of my whole process in and amongst the show, and then living this show for basically a year because we were performing it consistently, and everything just getting worse. And it was like, great, it's getting worse, but we have this art. We're gonna do this thing. We're here and we're queer. Like, so it was really great. I that was balm to my soul throughout that very frightening time.
Yeah.
And I don't even like, I mean, I can look at it now and even say like, it doesn't come across as very in your face queer whatsoever. I think it's the fact of, no, I've had to say a lot in interviews like, I don't have to do anything. My existence is a political statement. And me living my life as I am, as a queer non-binary person, is a political statement that I don't need to make because I'm the example.
Yeah.
And I feel what was so great about this is that we were able to show, I'm gonna get choked up now. We were able to show other queer folks that it was okay to just be themselves and not have to feel like they have to put something on there, that they have to do a show to be queer, that they have to follow certain performance guidelines or sexiness or acts of lust in order for it to be a queer show. And even the interaction, my being there is kind of like the director of like what was going on in the show with Katherine, between Katherine and Jessie, was like, there is an underlying innate queerness to their interaction, but you can also look at it and be like, it's not very queer, they're the same person. But like, it's the fact that you know about her life and who she was and what that underlying desire for her must have been that comes out in her own words, whether it's translated or not, it's there. And there is no explicit queer interaction really, I would think. I mean, as far my perspective of it, I don't see their interaction together being queer. It's their intermingling of these two different personalities, but you feel it, you know that it's there. And I think that is what speaks to so many people who have come to see it, particularly in that first premiere. It was like, I mean, I had young queer folks come up to me after the show and just being like, thank you for putting out something that doesn't disrespect us as sexual beings either. It's something that it speaks to our characters. Like, we're not all our sexuality. Like, queerness is much more than who we sleep with too. It's how we see the world. It's how we identify with ourselves on so many parts of ourselves. And for these younger folks to come up and say like, thank you for giving us something that was so much more well-rounded about who we are as how we identify. That's what I do. That's what my hope and mission is to do. Is when I make these works, is to let them know like, hey, yeah, like, I'm queer. This might be a queer like performance. This is a queer topic, but like, we're also human beings, and it's not all lying on just the realm of queer. You know, it's saying there's so many other facets of us, and it's not always pretty. Marie-Madeleine is a hardcore addict, and not by her own doing. That's rough.
Mm-hmm.
But and you don't have to be queer to have lived that story. But the fact that this is a queer woman who lived that story, it goes beyond that. It goes beyond those labels and identity, like different identities, the whole entire spectrum of it. There's so much familiarity with it, no matter who you are. And I love that we were able to create something as a team, because that's really what we were and still are in this production, to show other queer folks in particular that you exist and it's okay that you exist, and these other things, like, they happen to a queer woman, but it's not necessarily a queer thing. So guess what? You're not all that different. Like, you are a human being like all of us, you know? And I think that said a lot to the audience members. And I've had people of, like, I had a cis hetero gentleman, probably in his 50s, who came to the show, who bravoed and screamed it at the end, and like came up to me afterwards and just saying, like, number one, I've never seen an opera. I've never seen anything that had any kind of queer element to it. And he's like, I loved it. It was something like I can absolutely picture and can feel a relation to who she was as a person and how this affected her. And I'm like, you know, if that's amazing. I feel like it's a mission accomplished. It's just a mission accomplished. And I hope we have many, many more missions like this to accomplish.
That's so fantastic.
To that point, I wanted to add, and I have no desire to make this explicitly about straight people, but I think something that cishet straight people don't recognize is that when there are identities that aren't cishet that have to explore these thoughts, find out who they are, be vulnerable, you know, be intimate, this deep intimacy, this deep vulnerability that we had to sort of access to do this show. There are plenty of straight people who are hungry for that too, because it is healthy and it is good. And the societal structures that are in place as they are, that sort of rule the day, are bad for all of us. And again, no desire to make this about straight people and like what we need, but I think something we need to recognize is that, like, the gay community and basically non-cishet community has tapped into something deeply needed by everyone. And I'm personally grateful for that work being done. I know it's not for me, obviously, but I do directly benefit from it as a, you know, straight cis woman. And I'm grateful for that. I hope that's okay to say.
This is such a phenomenal conversation. I know we could keep talking about this fantastic work for hours and hours to come. As we wrap up, I always want to give an opportunity for people to share something I haven't asked you about. So if there's something that you want to share with the viewers about this piece, about the process that we haven't yet had a chance to talk about, please unmute yourself and share away.
Album comes out March 12th.
Album comes out March 12th. You know you all need it.
2021, so it's gonna be really fresh. It is something that we are going to be out there performing again. I guarantee it. Like, once we can get through this hurdle known as the pandemic, I know we will, because we've been very lucky as a team to have other universities come up to us and ask us if we'll perform it for their student body, and be able to share that with women's studies departments, gender studies, just, you know, overall music departments too with them. Like, I think and those people haven't forgotten us throughout this. Like, they're, I think, still planning on having us whenever it is safe to do so. And I think it's going to be a really great journey for a lot of us to continue with this. Yeah.
That's so fantastic. Well, thank you everyone for sharing your process, for sharing how this work came to be and what it has meant to you. And I hope everybody watching go get your album, go listen, get in contact with this creative team and bring them to your university, to your your performing arts center, to your museum, right? You performed in a museum. So this is a troupe that will be ready to go as the pandemic lifts. And I'm just so grateful to have a chance to talk to all of you about this really exciting work. Thank you so much.
Thanks
Thank
to you,
you,
Lisa.
Lisa. Thank you. I really appreciate it.
Lisa.
Thank you.